The seatbelt sign hadn't even dinged off before the stock ticker for Horizon Air turned bright red. In the span of a single flight, a legacy airline didn't just lose a high-value customer. They triggered a corporate avalanche that wiped out $500 million in market cap in under an hour. It started with a judgment call, a flight attendant looking at a man in a hoodie and deciding he didn't belong in seat 1A. She thought she was protecting the airline's image. Instead, she was humiliating the man who owned the debt on their entire fleet. This is the story of how arrogance cost an airline its future. The fluorescent lights of JFK's Terminal 4 hummed with the usual chaotic energy of a Tuesday morning. Outside Gate B32, the line for Horizon Air Flight 880 to London Heathrow was already snaking back toward the Hudson newsstand. It was a flagship route, the kind filled with investment bankers, tech moguls, and old money families returning to their Kensington townhouses. Brian Thorne stood near the priority lane, adjusting the strap of his worn-out leather duffel bag. He didn't look like the typical clientele for Horizon's prestige class. At 42, Brian had the build of a former linebacker, but his attire was strictly Silicon Valley casual. A charcoal hoodie, faded denim, and a pair of sneakers that looked like they had seen better days. He was tired. He had just spent 72 hours in intense negotiations regarding the acquisition of a semiconductor firm in Taiwan, and all he wanted was a glass of champagne and the lie-flat bed he had paid $12,000 for. He approached the podium. The gate agent, a harried-looking man named Greg with sweat stains on his collar, didn't even look up as he scanned Brian's digital boarding pass. "Seat 1A. Welcome aboard, Mr. Thorne," Greg mumbled, waving him through. Brian walked down the jet bridge, the cool air of the cabin hitting him as he stepped onto the plane. He turned left, heading toward the exclusive sanctuary of first class. There were only 8 suites, each an enclosed pod of leather and walnut wood. He found 1A. He tossed his duffel into the overhead bin and sank into the seat, closing his eyes. "Excuse me." The voice was sharp, clipped, and dripping with artificial sweetness. Brian opened one eye. Standing over him was the lead flight attendant. Her name tag read Beatrice, and she wore the Horizon Air uniform, navy blue with gold piping, like it was a judge's robe. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful, and her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yes?" Brian asked, sitting up slightly. "I think there's been a mistake," Beatrice said, not checking a manifest, just looking him up and down. Her eyes lingered on his sneakers. "This is the prestige cabin. Economy boarding is through the second door, past the galley." Brian sighed, suppressing the urge to roll his eyes. He was used to this. It happened at high-end restaurants, luxury car dealerships, and boardrooms before he introduced himself. The assumption that a black man in casual clothes was lost. "I know where I am," Brian said, keeping his voice calm. He pulled his phone out and tapped the screen, holding up the QR code. "Seat 1A, Brian Thorne." Beatrice glanced at the phone, then back at him. She didn't move. "May I see your physical identification, sir?" "Is that standard procedure?" Brian asked. "I scanned in at the gate." "It is when there's a discrepancy in the manifest," she lied smoothly. Brian reached into his back pocket and pulled out his passport. He handed it to her. She opened it, scanning the pages, looking for a flaw, a reason. Finding none, she snapped it shut and handed it back, her jaw tight. "Very well," she said, her tone suggesting she was doing him a massive favor. "You can stay, for now, but please keep your bag fully stowed. We have VIPs boarding, and we need the cabin to look presentable." "My bag is in the bin," Brian said, his voice dropping an octave. "Just like everyone else's." Beatrice turned on her heel and marched toward the galley without another word. Brian shook his head, putting his headphones on. He thought that was the end of it. He was wrong. 10 minutes later, the cabin was mostly full. A man in a bespoke three-piece Italian suit walked in. He was loud, talking on his phone about shorting the yen, and carried the air of someone who had never been told no in his life. This was Arthur P. Harrington, a mid-level hedge fund manager known more for his father's money than his own talent. Harrington stopped at row 1, looked at his boarding pass, and then looked at Brian. "Excuse me, buddy," Harrington said, tapping Brian on the shoulder. "You're in my spot." Brian paused his music. "I don't think so." 1A. "I always sit in 1A, Harrington announced, loud enough for the rest of the cabin to hear. He waved his hand dismissively. "Stewardess? Beatrice?" Beatrice appeared instantly, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She rushed over, her face transforming from icy disdain to fawning admiration. "Mr. Harrington, so good to see you again. Is there a problem?" "Yeah, there's a problem," Harrington sneered, gesturing at Brian. "There's a mix-up. This guy is in my seat. And frankly, I don't think the ventilation in here can handle that. Hoodie." Beatrice turned to Brian, her face hardening instantly. "Sir, I'm going to need you to gather your things." "Excuse me?" Brian unbuckled his seatbelt, but didn't stand. "I paid for this seat. I showed you my ticket. I showed you my ID." "We have a double booking situation," Beatrice said loudly. She wasn't whispering anymore. She wanted an audience. "Mr. Harrington is a Diamond Medallion member. In the event of a system glitch, priority goes to our loyalty members. I'm going to have to move you." "Move me where?" Brian asked, his blood beginning to boil. "We have a seat available in the main cabin," Beatrice said, checking a tablet she hadn't looked at once. "Row 42. It's a middle seat, but it's what we have." The cabin went silent. A woman in 2B lowered her magazine. A man in 3A adjusted his glasses. They were watching a man being kicked out of a seat he paid for, simply because another man looked the part, and he didn't. "Let me get this straight," Brian said, standing up. He towered over Beatrice. "You want to downgrade me from first class to economy, a $12,000 difference, because he wants to sit here." "It's policy, sir," Beatrice snapped. "If you don't comply, I will have to classify this as a disturbance, and I will have airport security remove you from the plane. Do you want to go to jail today, or do you want to go to London?" Brian looked at Harrington, who was smirking, checking his Rolex. He looked at Beatrice, whose arms were crossed in defiance. Brian took a deep breath. He thought about the merger. He thought about the press. He thought about the fact that if he got arrested today, the deal in London would collapse. "Fine," Brian said softly. He grabbed his duffel bag from the bin. "Smart choice, pal," Harrington laughed, slipping into the seat before Brian had even fully stepped out of the pod. "Maybe try Greyhound next time." Beatrice pointed toward the back of the plane. "Walk all the way to the back, and sir, try not to disturb the other first-class passengers on your way out." Brian walked. He walked past the lie-flat beds, past the premium economy seats with the extra legroom, past the exit rows. He walked all the way to row 42, the very last row of the plane, right next to the lavatories. The seats didn't recline. The smell of chemical toilet cleaner was pungent. He squeezed into the middle seat between a crying toddler and a man who was asleep and snoring loudly. Brian didn't complain. He didn't yell. He simply took out his phone. He connected to the onboard Wi-Fi as the plane taxied. He wasn't checking his email. He was opening his contacts. He scrolled past Mom and Lawyer until he found a number saved as Julian Vance, CEO Horizon Air, personal. He typed a single text message. "Julian, I'm currently in seat 42E on your flight 880. Your lead FA Beatrice just kicked me out of 1A so Arthur Harrington could sit there. I think we need to review the terms of my holding company's loan to your airline. You have 5 minutes. 30,000 feet below, in a glass-walled corner office in Chicago, Julian Vance was pouring himself a coffee. He was the CEO of Horizon Air, a man who had spent the last 5 years trying to rebrand the airline as the epitome of modern luxury. He was stressed. The quarterly earnings were due in a week, and the company was leveraging heavily on a massive loan provided by a private equity firm called Apex Capital. His phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. Julian glanced at it. When he saw the name Brian Thorne, his blood ran cold. Brian Thorne wasn't just a wealthy passenger. He was the founder of Apex Capital. He was the man who effectively owned Horizon Air's debt. If Brian Thorne decided to call in the loans, or worse, publicly dump the stock he held as collateral, Horizon wouldn't just have a bad day, they would be insolvent. Julian read the text. He read it twice. He felt the color drain from his face. "Oh God," Julian whispered. He hit the intercom button on his desk phone so hard it nearly cracked. "Sarah, get me the Flight Operations Center. Now. I need a direct line to the cockpit of Flight 8080. Get the station manager at JFK on the other line." "Yes, Mr. Vance," his assistant yelled back, sensing the panic. Back on the plane, the fasten seatbelt sign was still on as they climbed through the clouds. Beatrice was in the forward galley, shaking a martini for Mr. Harrington. She felt good. She had handled a situation, kept a VIP happy, and maintained the integrity of the cabin. In her mind, she was due for a commendation. The intercom in the galley beeped. It wasn't the standard chime. It was the triple chime, the code for an emergency call from the cockpit. Beatrice frowned and picked up the handset. "Cabin." Beatrice speaking. "Beatrice, this is Captain Miller." The pilot's voice was tight, strained. "I just got a message from ACRS. It came directly from the CEO's office. Chicago is demanding to know who is sitting in seat 1A. Beatrice paused, the shaker freezing in her hand. "Captain, it's Mr. Harrington, a Diamond Medallion member. There was a double booking, so I moved the other passenger to economy to accommodate." "You did what?" The captain's voice cracked. "Beatrice, listen to me carefully. The man you moved. What was his name?" "I don't know. Some guy in a hoodie." "Thorne, I think." There was a silence on the line, so profound Beatrice thought the connection had dropped. Then the captain spoke, his voice low and terrified. "Beatrice, the CEO just told me that Brian Thorne is the majority shareholder of the financing group that keeps this airline flying. He is personally texting Julian Vance right now. Vance is screaming. He says you just demoted the man who signs our paychecks." Beatrice felt her stomach drop. The martini shaker slipped from her damp fingers and clattered onto the metal floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet galley. "Fix it," the captain hissed. "Vance said if Mr. Thorne isn't happy within 5 minutes, he's grounding the fleet. Do you understand me? Fix it." The line went dead. Beatrice stood there, trembling. She looked out into the cabin. Arthur Harrington was laughing at a movie, sipping the drink she had given him earlier. She had to go back there. She had to go to row 42. Meanwhile, in row 42, Brian was calm. He had purchased the onboard Wi-Fi package, the expensive one. He opened his trading app. He owned 4% of Horizon Air's public stock personally, separate from his company's debt holdings. He tapped sell, all of it. It was a small block compared to the institutional holdings, but when a name like Brian Thorne dumps a stock, the algorithms notice. In Chicago, Julian Vance watched his monitor. A red line appeared on the Horizon Air stock ticker. It dipped 2%, then 5%. The market was reacting to the sudden volume spike. Rumors were already hitting the message boards. Why is Thorne dumping Horizon? Is the insolvency rumor true? Julian grabbed his phone and dialed the cockpit directly again. Tell her to move him back now, and tell Harrington to get the hell out of that seat. Back on the plane, Beatrice began the longest walk of her life. She walked past the confused passengers in economy, past the crying babies. She reached row 42. The smell of the lavatory was strong. Brian was typing on his laptop, his elbows tucked in tight to avoid hitting his neighbors. Mr. Thorne? Beatrice's voice was a squeak. Brian didn't look up. Yes, Beatrice? I have made a terrible mistake, she stammered, sweat beading on her forehead. Please, there has been a misunderstanding. We have cleared your seat in first class. Please come with me. Brian stopped typing. He slowly turned his head. The warmth was gone from his eyes. It was strictly business now. I'm comfortable, Brian said. The middle seat offers a unique perspective on the customer experience. I think I'll stay. I need to see exactly what $500 worth of service feels like, since that's what you decided I was worth. Sir, please! Beatrice was practically begging now. Captain Miller says, Mr. Vance called. Oh, Julian called? Brian smiled, a shark-like grin. Good. Then he knows I've just initiated a sell-off. Tell him I'm not moving until we land, and tell him I want a board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning. The first agenda item will be a review of staff training protocols regarding racial profiling and customer service. It wasn't, Beatrice gasped. Go away, Beatrice, Brian said, putting his headphones back on. Beatrice stood there, paralyzed. The passengers around them were staring. A teenager in 42A had his phone out, recording the entire interaction. Brian saw the phone. He winked at the kid. Upload that, Brian whispered. The kid hit post. The video hit Twitter, X, 3 minutes later. The caption read, Horizon Air FA begs black billionaire to come back to first class after kicking him out for a white dude. Stock is crashing. Horizon Air Dajonska Karma. It went viral instantly. In Chicago, Julian Vance watched the stock price plummet 12%. $500 million in market capitalization vanished into thin air. He put his head in his hands. But the drama at 30,000 feet was just getting started. Arthur Harrington, up in seat 1A, had no idea that the seat he was sitting in was currently the most expensive seat in aviation history, and he was about to find out that his diamond medallion status didn't mean a thing when you cross a man who can buy the airline. The cockpit of Flight 880 was usually a sanctuary of calm precision, but now it felt like a sinking ship. Captain Richard Miller stared at the A-car's screen, the digital messaging system used to communicate with the ground. Messages were scrolling in faster than he could read them. From Ops Center, media requests flooding switchboard. Confirm status of passenger Thorne. From CIO Vance. Update me now. Is he back in 1A? Stock down 18%. Board calling emergency meeting. Miller wiped sweat from his brow. He looked at his first officer, a young man named Davis, who looked terrified. Davis, you have the controls, Miller said, unbuckling his harness. Maintain altitude. Don't touch anything else. Captain, you're going back there? Davis asked, his eyes wide. It was highly irregular for a captain to leave the flight deck to deal with a passenger dispute, especially mid-flight over the Atlantic. I don't have a choice, Miller gritted out. Beatrice failed. If I don't fix this, we're not going to have jobs to come back to tomorrow. Miller put on his cap, adjusted his tie, and opened the reinforced cockpit door. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted. It was subtle but palpable. The other passengers, seasoned travelers who knew the rhythms of luxury travel, sensed the disturbance. They were whispering, In seat 1A, Arthur Harrington was oblivious. He had reclined the seat fully and was loudly FaceTiming someone on the plane's Wi-Fi, holding the phone up to his face. "Yeah, total upgrade," Harrington was bragging to the screen. "Some nobody was in my spot. You know how it is. You just got to assert dominance. Beatrice took care of it. She knows who the real money is." Captain Miller stopped at seat 1A. He loomed over Harrington. "Mr. Harrington," Miller said, his voice deep and authoritative. Harrington glanced up, annoyed. "Yeah? Can I get a refill?" "Beatrice is MIA. I need you to end your call," Miller said, "and I need you to listen to me very carefully." Harrington rolled his eyes, but clicked off the phone. "What is it? Turbulence?" "We have a situation regarding this seat," Miller said, keeping his voice low so as not to alert the whole cabin, though the woman in 2B was definitely listening. "The passenger you displaced. There has been a severe error in judgment by my flight crew. I need to ask you as a favor to the airline to voluntarily move to seat 4B. It is an aisle seat in this cabin. It is perfectly comfortable." Harrington laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. "You're joking, right? I'm not moving. I'm a Diamond Medallion member. I earned this spot. That guy in the back, he looked like he sells bootleg DVDs. He belongs in row 42. That man," Miller said, his patience snapping, "is Brian Thorne. He owns Apex Capital. He holds the debt on the aircraft you are currently sitting in. And because he is sitting in economy, Horizon Air's stock has dropped 20% in the last 30 minutes. We are bleeding millions by the second." Harrington's smirk faltered for a second, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. "So? Not my problem. I paid for my ticket. Possession is 9/10 of the law, Captain. I'm not moving." Miller stared at him. He realized then that Harrington wasn't just entitled. He was stupid. "Very well," Miller said coldly. "I will note in my log that you refused a direct request from the captain during an operational crisis." Miller turned away from Watanabe and walked past the galley. He saw Beatrice standing there, pale as a ghost, staring at her tablet. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "You and I are going to have a long talk in London," Miller whispered to her as he passed. Beatrice flinched. Miller continued his walk. He walked the entire length of the plane. It was a walk of shame. He passed the premium economy section, past the bulkheads, and entered the dense air of the main cabin. He found row 42. It was a surreal sight. Brian Thorne, a man worth billions, was wedged between a sleeping construction worker and a mother rocking a baby. Brian was typing calmly on his laptop, a half-eaten bag of pretzels on his tray table. Miller knelt in the aisle. The passengers nearby stopped talking. To see a four-stripe captain kneeling in economy was unheard of. "Mr. Thorne," Miller said, his voice humble. "I am Captain Miller. I want to personally apologize for the disrespect you've been shown today. It is unacceptable. I am asking you, please, allow me to escort you back to the cockpit jump seat, or we can move a crew member. Anything." Brian stopped typing. He looked at the captain. He saw a man who was trying to do the right thing, a man caught in the middle. Brian respected that, but the lesson wasn't finished yet. "Captain Miller," Brian said gently, "you have a safe flight to fly. I don't blame you, but I'm not moving." "Sir, the CEO is—" "Tell Julian," Brian interrupted, "that the view from here is illuminating. I'm learning a lot about his product. Did you know the audio jack in this seat is broken? And the tray table is sticky? Mr. Thorne, go back to the front, Captain," Brian said, returning to his screen. "Ensure we land safely. That is your only job right now. My business with the airline will be concluded on the ground." Miller stood up. He knew he was defeated. He nodded once, respectful, and turned back. As he walked away, the teenager in 42A, who had filmed the first encounter, held up his phone again. "Hey, Captain, is it true the airline is going bankrupt?" Miller didn't answer. He just kept walking. The Wi-Fi on Flight 880 was fast. Too fast. By the time Captain Miller returned to the cockpit, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from confusion to toxicity. The viral video of Beatrice kicking Brian out had been picked up by major news outlets. CNN had a banner. Airline apartheid, tech mogul, Brian Thorne forced to back of plane. But the real drama was happening in the financial markets, and ironically, in seat 1A. Arthur Harrington was a hedge fund manager, but he wasn't a very good one. His fund was highly leveraged. He was currently betting heavily against tech stocks, operating on thin margins. Because of the Wi-Fi, Harrington had his trading terminal open on his iPad. He wanted to check his positions. He refreshed the screen. He blinked. He refreshed it again. His portfolio was bleeding red. Massive, jagged lines of red. "What the hell?" Harrington muttered. He clicked on the news tab. The top story wasn't about the yen or oil prices. It was about Horizon Air. Breaking. Apex Capital rumored to trigger immediate debt recall on Horizon Air. Horizon stock, HZN, down 28%. Trading halted due to volatility. Harrington felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. His fund held a significant long position in Horizon Air. He had bought in heavily last week, convinced the quarterly earnings would pop. He had millions of his clients' money riding on Horizon stock going up. But it wasn't just Horizon. The panic was contagious. Because Brian Thorne was a bellwether investor, a man whose moves predicted market trends. His sudden liquidation of assets was causing a Thorne crash across the travel sector. The entire portfolio Harrington managed was nosediving. Harrington's phone rang. It was his boss, the senior partner of the fund, a man named Marcus Sterling. Harrington answered, his voice trembling. "Marcus, I know, the market is crazy right now, but—" "Shut up, Arthur." Marcus's voice was ice cold. "Check your email." I'm on a plane," Harrington stammered. "I know you're on a plane," Marcus screamed. "I'm looking at a video of you on Twitter right now. You're the guy. You're the idiot who kicked Brian Thorne out of his seat. It was a double booking." "It wasn't a double booking, you moron. You bullied a flight attendant into moving the single most powerful man in private equity. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Marcus, I didn't know." "We are getting margin calls, Arthur. Our liquidity is drying up because HZN is tanking. Clients are calling me, asking why my employee is trending on TikTok as the face of entitlement. You are toxic." "I can fix this," Harrington pleaded, looking around the cabin. People were staring at him now. They knew. The lady in 2B was holding her phone up, showing the video to her husband. "You can't fix this," Marcus said. "You're fired, Arthur. Effective immediately. Don't come to the office. Don't touch the accounts. You're done." The line went dead. Harrington sat there, the phone slipping from his hand onto the plush leather seat he had fought so hard for. He looked at the champagne glass on his tray. It looked sickening now. He had lost his job. He had lost his reputation. And his personal portfolio, heavily invested in the very funds he managed, was evaporating. He stood up. He had to do something. Panic overtook reason. He unbuckled and scrambled out of the suite. He ran to the galley where Beatrice was hiding. "You!" Harrington shouted, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You did this! You told me it was okay. You have to go tell them. Go tell Thorne it was your idea." Beatrice looked up. Her eyes were red and puffy. She had been crying for the last hour. The facade of the perfect, icy flight attendant was gone. "Sit down, Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice hollow. No, my boss just fired me. Do you hear me? I'm losing millions." Harrington was screaming now. He grabbed Beatrice's arm. "Get your hands off her!" The voice came from row 2. A large man in a suit stood up. It was an air marshal. He had been monitoring the situation silently, but physical contact crossed the line. The air marshal grabbed Harrington's wrist and twisted it behind his back, slamming him face first into the galley wall. "Arthur Harrington, you are under arrest for interfering with a flight crew member and assault," the marshal stated calmly. "I'm going to need you to stop struggling." "You can't arrest me. I'm in first class," Harrington wailed as plastic flex cuffs were tightened around his wrists. "Not anymore," the marshal said. "We're going to the back. There's a jump seat near the rear lavatory with your name on it." As Harrington was frog-marched down the aisle, the entire plane watched. He was dragged past the curtain, past the rows of silent passengers. When they reached row 42, the marshal stopped for a brief second to adjust his grip. Harrington looked up. He was eye-level with Brian Thorne. Brian looked up from his laptop. He took off his noise-cancelling headphones. Harrington looked like a broken man. His suit was rumpled, his face red, his wrists bound. "Mr. Thorne," Harrington whimpered. "Please, tell them. It was a misunderstanding." Brian looked at him with zero sympathy. He picked up his plastic cup of lukewarm water. "You were right, Arthur," Brian said calmly. "Possession is 9/10 of the law, and right now you don't possess a seat, or a job, or from what I see on the news, a future." Brian turned back to his screen. The marshal dragged Harrington to the rear jump seat, strapped him in, and sat opposite him. The plane began its descent into London. But for the people on board, the turbulence had nothing to do with the wind. The reckoning was waiting on the tarmac. The landing gear of Flight 880 locked into place with a heavy thud, signaling the end of the 7-hour ordeal. As the massive Boeing 737 taxied toward Terminal 3 at London Heathrow, the cabin was eerily quiet. Usually, this was the moment of shuffling bags and clicking seatbelts. Today, nobody moved. They were all waiting to see what would happen next. The captain's voice crackled over the PA system. He sounded exhausted. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Local authorities will be boarding the aircraft to escort specific passengers off the plane before general deplaning can commence." In the rear galley jump seat, Arthur Harrington was weeping silently. The alcohol had worn off, leaving only the crushing reality of his situation. He was handcuffed, fired, and about to be handed over to the London Metropolitan Police. The cabin door opened, but it wasn't the cleaning crew or the gate agent. 4 officers from the Met Police entered, wearing high-visibility jackets. Behind them walked a woman in an immaculately tailored grey suit. She didn't look like airline staff. She looked like a shark in human clothing. This was Elena Rostova, the managing partner of Kirkland & Ellis in London, one of the most aggressive litigation firms in the world. She wasn't there for the airline. She was there for Brian. Beatrice, standing by the door, tried to muster some authority. "Ma'am, you can't be on here." Elena didn't even glance at her. She walked straight past the flight attendants, past the first-class pods, and headed for economy. The police officers stopped at the rear galley. They hoisted Harrington up by his arms. "Arthur Harrington?" the lead officer asked. "Please," Harrington sobbed. "My father is Senator—" "Save it for the magistrate, son," the officer said, marching him forward. As Harrington was dragged down the aisle, he passed Brian Thorne. Brian was standing now, stretching his back. He looked at Harrington one last time. "Enjoy the coach to the station, Arthur," Brian said quietly. "I hear the legroom is terrible." Harrington was hauled off the plane to the sound of scattered applause from the economy cabin. Then, Elena Rostova reached row 42. She extended a hand to Brian. "Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice professional and crisp. "I'm Elena. Your legal team in New York contacted me while you were over the Atlantic. We have a car waiting on the tarmac, and we have secured the Windsor suite in the terminal for the emergency board meeting." Brian nodded, grabbing his battered duffel bag. "Thank you, Elena. Let's go." As Brian walked to the front of the plane, the atmosphere was electric. The passengers in economy, the teachers, the students, the families, started clapping. It wasn't polite applause. It was a roar. They had watched him handle the humiliation with grace, and now they were watching him leave as a king. He reached the front door. Beatrice was standing there, shaking. She looked small. Brian stopped. He looked at her name tag, then at her face. "You have a difficult job, Beatrice," Brian said, his voice devoid of anger, which made it worse. "But you forgot the golden rule of service. Dignity is not a commodity you sell only to the highest bidder. It's a right. Mr. Thorne, Beatrice started to cry. "You'll be hearing from HR," Brian said softly. He stepped out onto the jet bridge, Eleanor flanking him. The cold London air hit his face. Down on the tarmac, a convoy of black Range Rovers was waiting. The airline hadn't sent them. Brian's partners had. But parked right next to them was a solitary airport operations vehicle. A man in a Horizon Air uniform stood there, looking terrified. It was the London station manager. "Mr. Thorne," the manager called out, running over. "Please! Mr. Vance is on the video link in the conference room. He begs you to give him 10 minutes before you speak to the press." Brian checked his watch, a cheap digital Casio that he wore for traveling. "Tell Julian I'm coming," Brian said. "But tell him to have his resignation letter drafted. I want to proofread it." The Windsor suite at Heathrow is reserved for heads of state and royalty. It is a fortress of privacy, disconnected from the chaos of the public terminals. Today, it was the site of an execution. Brian sat at the head of a long oak table. Elena sat to his right, her laptop open, displaying a live feed of the stock market. Horizon Air, HCN, was currently halted from trading after a 35% freefall. On the massive screen on the wall, the face of Julian Vance was projected in 4K resolution. He was in his Chicago office, but he looked like he had aged 10 years in 7 hours. His tie was loosened, his eyes wild. "Brian," Julian said, his voice cracking through the high-end speakers. "Brian, please, we can fix this. I've already issued a press release apologizing. I've fired the flight attendant. I've banned Harrington for life. What else do you want?" Brian leaned back, steepling his fingers. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "You think this is about a seat, Julian?" Brian asked calmly. "I know it was disrespectful. I know," Julian pleaded. "But you can't tank the company over one bad employee. We employ 40,000 people. If you call the debt, we go under. The pensions, the contracts, it all goes away." "It wasn't one bad employee," Brian said, his voice hardening. "It was a culture, Julian. A culture you built. You rebranded Horizon as the exclusive airline. You told your staff to prioritize high-value optics over paying customers. Beatrice didn't act in a vacuum. She did exactly what your training manuals implied she should do, protect the image of the first-class cabin at the expense of the reality." Brian slid a folder across the table. Eleanor opened it. "Mr. Vance," Eleanor spoke up, "we have reviewed the terms of the mezzanine financing agreement between Apex Capital and Horizon Air. There is a reputational harm clause in Section 14B. It states that if the airline's management engages in conduct that materially damages the lender's brand association, the lender has the right to accelerate repayment." Julian went pale. "You're invoking 14B? That's the nuclear option? The video of your staff kicking a black CEO to the back of the bus has 50 million views, Elena said dryly. Our investors are calling us asking why we bankroll bigots. The reputational harm is material. It is catastrophic. I can't pay it back, Julian whispered. We don't have the cash on hand. I know, Brian said, which means you're in default. The room went silent. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound. However, Brian continued, standing up and walking toward the screen, I don't want 40,000 people to lose their jobs because their CEO is incompetent. I'm not going to bankrupt the airline. Julian let out a breath he had been holding. Thank you. Oh God, thank you, Brian. Don't thank me yet, Brian said. I'm not calling the debt. I'm converting it. Julian's eyes widened. Converting it? To what? Equity, Brian said. At the current valuation, which, thanks to today's crash, is incredibly low, my debt holdings are worth enough to give me a controlling interest in the company. You're taking over? Julian stammered. Hostile takeover? It's not hostile, Julian. Brian smiled coldly. It's a rescue. As of this moment, Apex Capital is the majority shareholder of Horizon Air. Brian turned to Elena. Draft the paperwork. He turned back to the screen. And Julian, as the new owner, my first act is to restructure the executive leadership team. Brian, wait! You're fired, Julian! You can't do this! Julian shouted, standing up in his office 4,000 miles away. I just did, Brian said. Pack your desk. You have 5 minutes, the same amount of time Beatrice gave me to vacate my seat. Brian signaled to the technician to cut the feed. The screen went black. Brian sat back down. He felt the exhaustion in his bones. He hadn't slept in 24 hours. What now, boss? Elena asked, closing her laptop. Now, Brian said. We rehire. He pulled out his phone. He found the contact for the union representative of the Horizon flight attendants. Get me the head of the union, Brian said. We're going to rewrite the training manual. No more prestige class. No more judging passengers by their hoodies. We're going to build an airline that treats people like human beings. And what about the press? Elena asked. There are 100 reporters outside. Brian stood up and straightened his hoodie. Let's go talk to them, he said. I think I have a story they'll want to hear. 6 months later, the corporate headquarters of Horizon Air in Chicago bore little resemblance to the sterile, fear-driven palace Julian Vance had built. The frosted glass walls that once separated the executives from the support staff had been removed, replaced by an open-floor plan that buzzed with a nervous but hopeful energy. Brian Thorne sat in what used to be Julian's office. He hadn't moved in. In fact, he had turned the massive, mahogany-paneled suite into a collaborative workspace for the operations logistics team. Brian himself worked out of a modest glass cubicle near the break room. He wanted to hear the complaints, the coffee machine gossip, and the reality of the business he had accidentally acquired. The rebranding was brutal but necessary. The prestige class gold signage was scrapped, melted down, and sold. The elitist training manuals, which instructed flight attendants to profile passengers based on perceived net worth, were shredded. In their place came the Horizon Promise, a manifesto Brian had written himself on a napkin during his flight back from London. It was simple. Every passenger, from row 1 to row 42, is a guest in our home. But while the airline was healing, the people who had poisoned it were facing the cold reality of a world that no longer tolerated their arrogance. The fall of Julian Vance. 3 miles away, in a cramped recruitment office, Julian Vance adjusted his tie. It was a cheap tie. He had sold his Hermes collection to pay his legal fees. He was interviewing for a mid-level management position at a logistics trucking company, a far cry from the private jets and boardrooms he was used to. The recruiter, a young woman who looked fresh out of college, stared at his resume, then at him. She didn't look impressed. She looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Vance," she said, sliding the paper back across the desk, "your credentials are extensive. But we've done a background check. I understand there was some negative press," Julian said, his voice trembling slightly. "But that was a misunderstanding. I was protecting the company's bottom line." "You lost the company $500 million in 45 minutes, the recruiter corrected him sharply. "Our drivers come from all walks of life. We can't hire a CEO who became the global face of corporate discrimination. It's a liability issue." "I need a job," Julian whispered, his pride finally breaking. "I have a mortgage. I have tuition payments." "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance," she said, standing up to signal the end of the meeting. "We went with a candidate who has better optics." Julian walked out into the grey Chicago rain, realizing that the optics he had worshipped so dearly were now the very thing rendering him unemployable. While Julian was losing his future, Arthur Harrington was paying for his past. The Thorn crash hadn't just wiped out his portfolio, it had exposed the fraudulent foundation of his hedge fund. When the SEC finished their audit, Harrington wasn't just broke, he was indebted. His penthouse in Manhattan was foreclosed. His Aston Martin was repossessed. But the courts weren't done with him. For the assault on the air marshal, the judge, a stern woman who had seen the viral video, decided a fine wasn't enough. She wanted him to learn humility. On a humid Tuesday morning, Arthur Harrington stood on the side of the Long Island Expressway. He wasn't wearing a bespoke Italian suit. He was wearing an oversized neon orange vest over a stained t-shirt. He held a trash picker in one hand and a heavy black bag in the other. A luxury SUV sped past, honking loudly. Mud splashed onto Harrington's legs. He flinched, looking up. "Keep working, Harrington," his supervisor yelled from the truck. "That median isn't going to clean itself." Arthur stabbed a piece of trash with his picker. It was a fast food wrapper, greasy and torn. As he shoved it into the bag, he thought about the champagne he had sipped in seat 1A. He thought about how he had laughed at Brian for his hoodie. Now Arthur would have killed for a hoodie. The cold wind bit through his thin shirt, and for the first time in his life, Arthur Harrington was invisible to the people driving by. Just another piece of the scenery, cleaning up the mess of a world he used to think he owned. The Newark Liberty International Airport was bustling. In Terminal C, the morning rush was peaking. At a generic coffee franchise near Gate 30, the line was 10 people deep. Behind the counter, steam hissed from an espresso machine. Beatrice wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. Her feet ached. She used to wear heels that clicked authoritatively on the galley floor. Now she wore orthopedic, non-slip shoes that smelled of stale milk. "1 caramel macchiato, extra hot," she called out, her voice raspy. A businessman in a suit grabbed the cup without looking at her. "Took you long enough," he muttered, checking his watch. "I'm sorry, sir," Beatrice said automatically. "We're short-staffed." She turned back to the register. She saw a face she recognized. It was a frequent flyer from her Horizon days, a woman named Mrs. Galloway who used to bring chocolates for the crew. Beatrice smiled, a flicker of hope rising in her chest. "Mrs. Galloway?" Beatrice asked softly. "It's me, Beatrice, from Flight 880. Mrs. Galloway looked up. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't smile. She looked at Beatrice's name tag, then at her apron. "I know who you are," Mrs. Galloway said coldly. "I saw what you did to that man. You're lucky you have a job at all." Mrs. Galloway took her coffee and walked away. Beatrice stood there, frozen. The shame was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. She realized then that she hadn't just lost a career. She had lost her place in society. She was the woman who had kicked a hero to the back of the bus, and the world had a long memory. Brian Thorne walked through the terminal of Newark Airport, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He was flying to London again, to close the loop on the merger that had started this whole saga. He approached the gate. The mood was different. The gate agents were laughing with passengers. A pilot was high-fiving a kid. The toxicity was gone. "Mr. Thorne." Brian turned. Captain Richard Miller was standing by the jet bridge entrance. He looked younger, the stress lines around his eyes smoothed out. "Captain," Brian grinned. "Ready for the run across the pond?" "Always, sir," Miller said, "and the crew wanted me to thank you. The new profit-sharing model, it's changed lives. People are actually proud to wear the uniform again." "They earned it," Brian said. "I just signed the checks." Brian boarded the plane. It was the flagship aircraft, completely retrofitted. He walked into the business cabin. It was sleek, comfortable, and crucially, unpretentious. He found seat 1A. He placed his bag in the overhead bin. "Excuse me, sir?" Brian turned. Standing in the aisle was a young man, no older than 20. He was wearing U.S. Army fatigues, his boots scuffed and dusty. He held a boarding pass in shaking hands. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. "I think I'm in your way," the soldier said, trying to squeeze past Brian to get to the economy section. "I'm in 42C. Brian looked at the kid. He saw the dark circles under his eyes. He saw the heavy rucksack that likely contained everything he owned. "Heading home?" Brian asked. "Yes, sir. Just finished a tour. Going back to see my mum in Leicester," the soldier replied politely. Brian looked at seat 1A. It was a pod with a lie-flat bed, a massage function, and a 20-inch screen. Then he looked at the long, narrow aisle leading back to the cramped rows of economy. "You know," Brian said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet cabin, "I think there's been a mistake with the ticketing system. It happens sometimes." The soldier looked panicked. "A mistake? Sir, I have to get on this flight. I haven't seen my family in a year." No. Brian smiled, reaching into his pocket. "The mistake is that they put a VIP in the back." Brian took his own boarding pass for seat 1A and pressed it into the soldier's hand. "Take this," Brian said. "Seat 1A. It lays flat. You can sleep the whole way." "Sir, I can't," the soldier stammered, his eyes widening. "That's a $5,000 seat. I can't pay you for that." "You already paid," Brian said firmly, "with your service. But where will you sit?" "I've got a spot reserved," Brian said, grabbing his duffel bag. "Trust me, it's got a great view." Before the soldier could argue, Brian patted him on the shoulder and walked away. He walked past the stunned business travelers. He walked past the premium economy section. He walked all the way to the tail of the plane. The scent of the lavatory cleaner was there, faint but familiar. The engine hum was louder. He found row 42. A young mother was sitting in the window seat, struggling to calm a fussing baby. She looked up, stressed and apologetic, as Brian stopped at the row. "I'm so sorry," she said, bouncing the baby. "He's teething. He might cry the whole way." Brian tossed his bag into the overhead bin and squeezed into the middle seat next to her. "Don't apologize," Brian said, buckling his belt. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, soft packet of earplugs he had grabbed from the front, handing them to her. "We're all in this together." The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, flight time to London is 6 hours and 30 minutes. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the new horizon." Brian leaned his head back against the thin, uncomfortable seat cushion. His knees were touching the seat in front of him. His elbow was jammed against the armrest. He closed his eyes and smiled. It was the most comfortable he had ever felt, because this time he wasn't just a passenger. He was the pilot of the ship, and he was steering it toward something far more valuable than profit. He was steering it toward justice. This story is a powerful reminder that true power isn't about the seat you sit in or the clothes you wear. It's about how you treat people when you think no one is watching. Horizon Air learned the hard way that arrogance is the most expensive liability a company can have. From the flight attendant who judged a book by its cover to the CEO who put profits over people, they all paid the price. But in the end, justice was served and dignity was restored. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to support the channel. It really helps us create more stories like this. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new drama. And tell me in the comments, if you were Brian, would you have fired the CEO or given him a second chance? I read every comment. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.